Welcome to Great Northern Cascade Division in N scale. I've got the camera facing a different way this time because I have the pink prairie now rather than the plywood empire. We're moving into the pink prairie stage. 2-inch foam sub-broad bed for the return loop. So I've got the camera sitting on the station. Just here is going to be the south side of the station, coming around the return loop, through some turnouts, and then we're going to come and start to run along the sound. So you might be able to see how it's kind of cut in to that 2-inch foam roadbed, and the idea there is that we'll be able to create some kind of a water effect, pretend that we're running along the sound. We're really starting to move a little bit away from the prototype of what it would be like south of the stations, but it's like, operationally I think it works well. So in this video I'm going to talk about and kind of go through a little bit about putting down this sub-road bed from the 2-inch foam, then getting the actual foam, Woodland Scenic foam road bed down to go underneath the track, and then I've also got all of the track actually cut and pinned in place. None of it is wired up. I'm going to do that in the next video over the next week or two. But this one kind of go through some of the thought process as to why I went the way I did, why I've done some of the scenic stuff as if you'd be running along the water rather than doing it a little bit more industrial, maybe it's like it would be as you were heading down towards Tacoma. And it's really more because of this second level. When we think about what's going to be going in here with the Cascade and coming through the Cascade tunnel right beneath where the return loop is, I didn't want to have it too harsh by having a big industrial scene on top and then right below we're trying to show what the Cascades would be. A little bit too jarring. So I think this is going to work out pretty well. I'm excited with the progress that I've made, and then like I say, hopefully I'll be back in a week or two with all this track wired up and running trends. So hope you enjoy this. All right, so I'm still thinking a little bit about signaling and stuff like that. Thought I would make a start on the turnaround loop here. So let's try and orient ourselves. Baker's wanting to orient himself upstairs. Got the Seattle stations here, King Street Station, Union Station. This will be coming out the south end of the station. And we're going to come around here. There's then going to be 2 turnouts in here that will bring these 2 tracks together, and then the other turnout will then split the tracks as you go into the return loop, and then insulated rail joiners on basically all 4 joins for both tracks that come out from that turnout, and then through the Digitrax unit, which I'm completely blanking, the PM74, the power management unit. One of those sub-districts will then be configured for automatic reversing, so as the trains come in and out through that turnout, as needed, the polarity of the rails can swap depending on the direction that they were coming in, things like that. So you would come around out of here into the return loop, and really all this is for, kind of res up a little bit, is that you can come around that return loop and come back in. So this ends up being about a 15-inch radius, which is a lot tighter than I would want. It's kind of tighter than the other curves that are going to be on the layout, but I think it will be fine. 15 inches is still a good amount in scale. Most of the radiuses that I have are going to be getting up more like 20, 22 inches, something like this. This will end up being about a 15-inch radius on the track. I think it's actually 34 inches across, 35 inches across, something like that. So yeah, it's going to be about 15-inch radius on the track itself. And so the idea is that you got 2 tracks off in the distance you can see, and so one track will come up, come around and into a balloon, and then go back in. Now the reason for that, if you've followed the channel for a little while, what I originally thought was that I was going to have 1 track front, 1 track on the rear, and then in the middle I was going to cut out this pink prairie of the 2-inch foam, and that was kind of where the Port of Seattle was going to be. Once I actually put some of the track down in place, just to kind of get an idea, you don't want the track right flush, you want it a couple of inches back, and then the track wouldn't be running right up along the port wall. It would be a little bit of a gap. It's like, well, it's barely even a river wide, and so a little bit weird. So we're going to blame Rich, I think, for this one. His idea was actually both of the tracks would go at the back, and then this front side I'm planning on cutting out to make what would be the Port of Seattle. And so again, it's all somewhat simulated. I'm going to say it's the port, I could say it's the sound, I'm not entirely sure, because again, I had thought it might be cool to be able to model some kind of industry along here, such that, you know, ship could come in and then there'll be some amount of industry to be able to unload that ship. A train could come in, but then it's just like, no, because now I'm starting to make things more complicated. I really do just want this to be a return loop, so I might just model that this is southbound, kind of going past the port, but not really modeling anything. So you would have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics if you do know the area. The Port of Seattle is actually on the far side, on the west side of the stations. And so essentially what you'll be doing is you'll be coming around here. You're now going from, I'm east of the station, looking to the stations, looking west, looking to the stations. The port is on that side. As you transition through here and you start to come into the return loop, the mental gymnastics is that it's almost, now I'm on the west of the Sound, looking across the water. I'm now looking east, back to the tracks. And so almost in theory, the Seattle stations are going to be on the far side. I'm okay with that. Again, this isn't modeled 100% faithfully to the prototype. This is much more of a freelance, somewhat based on the real life area. So I think I'm okay with this. And I think this would then fit a little bit better. It gives me a little bit more room to do some of the scenery. It helps with this idea that, you know, really the whole layout is a little bit more for rail fanning than hardcore operations and stuff. So I'm hoping to do justice on the scenery. Trains just happen to be running through it, especially once we get down into what will be the Cascade Tunnel. This middle deck was rail fanning on Highway 2 along the Skycomish Valley. So I'm okay with the kind of mental gymnastics here, and I like the idea that you would have some scenery in here, and then it could actually be something kind of neat. Trains are then going to be on the back, come through a return loop, a little bit boring, a little bit weird, but again, I'm okay with that. And almost what I could do is model some kind of hill over there, and so go under a road overpass or something, the trains disappear, and so as they're coming around that loop part, it's actually hidden inside a hill, maybe. I don't know. Originally I had looked at some kind of overpass here to kind of make that part of the track hidden, but I think maybe that's a little bit of a better idea now. We could do something like that. We'll see. So I think what I'm going to do is do a combination of this 2-inch foam, some of it's plywood, just to give you an idea. Got a little bit of an offcut. You know, someone had said when I was doing all of this down here for the stations, you know, I could have done foam. It's just like I could have done, but the reason now, if you go back 3 months worth of videos, why was I resing the plywood decking 2 inches? It's because this foam is 2 inches, and so it fits in perfectly height-wise. So this was all plywood because it was going to be big, large, flat areas. It makes it a whole lot easier to have been able to drill through a whole bunch of holes for the feeder wires. It makes it a bunch easier once all the switch machines come in. And so I think what I might end up doing is having plywood through to about here where the turnouts will be. Again, just to make it a little bit easier for wiring in the switch machines underneath the turnout, screwing, attaching in the switch machines, and then the rest will switch to foam. I know you can put switch machines underneath the foam, but you then got to make the throw arm a little bit longer and stuff like that. So that's the theory. So probably a little bit more of the pink prairie coming in here. We got a break from the plywood empire after I finally painted everything to start to get rid of a plywood empire. Now I'm going for pink prairie, but okay. So let's see a little bit of progress as we go. This is where I've kind of gotten to. I'm going to leave this, I think, for a night or two. Just kind of let this bake in my head and see if this is kind of what I'm wanting to go for. I think it is. I think I'm quite happy with kind of the way it would flow. And again, you know, the fascias are going to curve kind of like the skyboards do. It's not sharp angles it's going to bend around. The fun part would be if I had some kind of clear acrylic inch and a quarter that would come across the front to then hold the water in. I have a thin piece of plywood as the base, and then Woodland Scenic have some water materials. I need a lot of it to fill this space, but some kind of clear acrylic probably is on the front, and then the black fascia will probably then sit about flat. Well, just whatever the height of the plywood is, it would kind of come flush along here. The rest would be clear acrylic into the water. Water would come, yeah, about half, maybe it's an inch or so up. We'll see. But I think this is a good flow. I think it adds quite a bit of scenic interest. Actually, it will be quite interesting because you'll come from the stations. Like I said, there's a mental gymnastics where it doesn't really run along the sound until you get way south, and it still isn't really running along the sound. It's very we're really kind of deviating away from the prototype, but that's okay. Rule number one: it's my railroad. I think where I'd struggled is exactly what I was going to do with here. Really, it's just that return loop to get the trains turned around and back into the station. And so I think this kind of scenic area would help, because if we think we've got King Street Union stations here, we're going to have downtown Seattle modeled on the end of the peninsula as we go around the curve, other side of the skyboard into Bay Yard, and then kind of the other part of this we're then going to have as you start to come into Everett. So there's just a whole lot of just track scenery is going to be kind of devoid because there's just going to be so much industry or cityscape going on. So I think this will be good, and I think visually this works, that if we go back to this idea that as you would first come down into the tram room, if I come back over to where the stairs are down in the basement, Stevens Pass area, Cowboy Mountain, coming Cascade Tunnel is going to be around here. And so if this was just kind of very harsh maritime industry, dock industry, it would be kind of jarring to essentially the Cascade Mountains here. And so this, if this is a little bit more just scenic, coming along the sound, almost like you would on the north, really, as if you drop down from Everett. It's almost what you're modeling as you come down the sound from Everett, Marysville, down to the Bay Yard. I think that will go well with more of the Cascade feel that we'd have here. So still, I'm going to give this a night or two. Let that sit, let that make sure that's okay. That's what I want in my head. Plywood section, I'll go in here just to bring it, curve it around, cut some plywood, get that in place. And once I figure out how far down I want to have the turnouts to go out of the stations, out of the return loop, then I can start to drop that track. This is now with coming out of the south side of the station, around in a little bit of Pink Prairie, just because it was easy for me to do that. Same thing, it's curved around the radius on the back there, 18-inch radius curve, and so the track will loosely follow about an 18-inch radius curve as well. This isn't a bridge, I just haven't put a Pink Prairie section in front of that either, but went with plywood over here because this is where the two turnouts are going to be. So the two tracks are going to come in south from the station into a turnout and then pop out into another turnout, which is where you'll go into the return loop. And so, like I'd said before, it's just easy. I can just do a plywood little section here, and it makes it a little bit easier attaching in the switch machines. Leaving that there just to prove that it is level. It's always a little weird when you take a step back and it's like, that's not level, but when you actually have the level on it, it is. And then come around into, like I said, the rest of this Pink Prairie section that we had. The paint cans are just to weigh it down to make sure that I had the right height on there. If you had the weight off, then it brings it up, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch, maybe something like that, and in end scale, by the time you put the track down, that 1/8 of an inch would end up being pretty pronounced. So I had kind of slept on this, I kind of left it be, and I actually do like the idea of it. Like I said, we've got a little bit of that mental gymnastics in that as you would come southbound out of the station, you would expect that the tracks are going to be this side of the water, and actually they're not. They're going to pop on the other side of the water. But in terms of scenic interest, I actually think that this will work out. This will work out pretty well. So I think the next step is going to be getting the pink foam adhered to the benchwork, because like I say, it's floating a little bit in places. I did have to shim a little bit, so I need to look at some of that. That's the only kind of disadvantage, is that you know, I can account for some amount of difference in those cross pieces when I have these little wooden pieces, strips of 1x3. That's all I'm using, 1x3 furring strips, just to kind of res that up. You know, I can make it fairly even, but here, I don't know, as I take it off, it's not too bad. It doesn't need to be quite that pronounced. And by the time that one gets weighed down, you know, I need to just get some glue on it, get some wets on it, hold it down, and I think that'll work pretty well. And then we can start to look at loosely pinning down some of the Woodland Scenic foam track bed, some of the track itself, and kind of get an idea of how this is all going to look. This is now with all of it glued down in place. I think that worked out pretty well. Now I'm trying to figure out the actual radius of the curves over here. So let's try and step up a little bit. One thing that I had done was very loosely cut a bunch of, what is it, 3/8 inch, maybe it's 1/2 inch, just MDF. I just had some scrap board around, and so measured out 14, 15, 16, all the way through 24-inch radius, which is what I've got up top right now. Very roughly cut, you know, they're not perfect, but what they do give is just quick gauges that I can lay down to try and figure out what the radius of a certain curve would be. So again, let's pop back up. There's the 24-inch radius in there now. So orient ourselves again. We're on the south side of King Street Station, Union Station, and so the tracks would come down into a nice broad 24-inch radius curve, and then they'll come into 2 turnouts around about here somewhere, bring them together, and then they'll pop out again. Maybe a little bit tight over on that side. It's not tight, 24-inch radius and end scale. Maybe a little bit tight over here. It might be coming to about 20-inch radius, something like that. I haven't put one of those wood gauges down. But the idea here is that I've got, you know, marks in the permanent marker as to where the actual center line is. You know, the ones that I cut on either side aren't perfectly rounded, but that center mark is, and so I can just put a pencil down, kind of mark where it would be, and then lay the foam track bed in place so that we have roughly a 24-inch radius curve. It gets pretty close. Tack those down, be able to glue those down. Exact same process that I did over here on the station. So if you're wondering, you know, how am I gluing the foam down, how am I going to then be gluing the track down, you know, check out some of those previous videos. Essentially, I think it's for here, because I'm doing foam to foam, it will probably be PL 300 adhesive. Over here I just use regular white glue. Not entirely sure how regular white glue will go foam to foam, probably be fine. And then when we come to doing the track, it's basically just a project adhesive cork put on, use a little spatula to spread it out, and, you know, pin the track, pin the foam in place so it sticks to the curves, and that should be it. So let's at least get this section done in place into the turnouts, and then have a little look at what that all looks like. This is now with all of that track bed glued in place. Use this Loctite PL 300 foam board adhesive. Really, you just want something that's not gonna eat into or melt the foam. And then 2 turnouts are kind of loosely laid out in place as to where they're going to be. There is a gap of about 8 inches or so between the ends of those turnouts, so that if you did have something that was coming from the inside part of the return loop and then was going to immediately go into this inside curve that would go into Union Station, you would have a very short stretch section where those 2 turnouts would join. And so coming in from a curve to a very short straight back into another curve, doesn't necessarily become an S curve where you could have cars that would kind of whip around, but it's not ideal. So put a gap between them. Go for about the length of the longest car that you're going to have. At least that's kind of how I do it. There's different trends of thought on that, but it means that you'll come essentially through the curve section. The cars then have the opportunity to straighten up, and then they go into the next curve section. So again, there's different trends of thought on exactly how far the gap should be. Some people say half the length of the longest car, some people say the longest car, some people say 1.5 times the length of the longest car. I've gone for about 8 inches, and passenger car that I have is about 6.25 inches, so that should be okay. and then come through into the actual turnaround loop itself. One of the few areas that's going to be double track, but I also thought it would be kind of cool. You know, I could have moved the turnaround loop more over to here, but then this is kind of a lot of dead space. It's like, okay, I've still then got 2 tracks that could come down, but because of the length of the trans, you know, I'd still have the back end in one of the stations, even if, you know, we didn't have the turnaround loop come into somewhere like this. But I thought, well, if we're somewhat going with the idea that this is south of the station and maybe it's coming along the sound, which you wouldn't really do like this, then maybe you would have 2 tracks. So a little bit of operational interest, even though it's only ever going to have 1 train and a return loop, and you just go around. There's the actual return pod itself. 15-inch radius down there, I think I had mentioned before. So that should be okay. It's one of the tightest curves that we're going to have on the layout, and again, N scale 15-inch radius is absolutely fine, but it is a little tighter than most of the other ones. Like I say, the ones that we have over here, 24-inch radius on both of these curves, that's a little bit more normal. That's kind of the radius that I'm going for, 22 to 24 inches. So gonna let that adhesive dry now, because I've used a lot of track pins to hold all this in place. Let that adhesive dry, take it up, and then start to loosely put the track down in place, figure out starting to cut it, and then we'll be able to go ahead and glue that. All of the track now is laid out, pinned in place. It's all kind of cut to length. None of it is wired up, none of it is glued in, haven't even drilled any of the holes for the feeder wires and stuff like that. Hasn't actually been too bad. It's been pretty quick. It's nowhere near as involved as having to do all of the turnouts and you know, all the different platforms that we had over in the station. So this is then the return loop as you would come around, kind of balloon around, and so that's why I think it was 15-inch radius. So a little tighter maybe than I would want. Probably the tightest that we're going to have in the layout, but kind of is what it is. Coming through, then double track running just so it kind of looks cool, and then we'd have something resembling not quite a beach, not quite a seawall, but just where the ocean sound would come up and meet it there. This was then the big 22 or 24-inch radius curves coming through here. These are then the 2 turnouts now as they are kind of pinned in place, ready to go. I think that will work out pretty good. And then through the tracks that will then go up into King Street Station on the far side, Union Station on the near side. So different ways that we could have done this, kind of as I talked through this with Rich, and you know, kind of looked at it. Could have just put a crossover in here, and so no matter which track you came in, which station you came in from, into the return loop and through crossovers, could have avoided probably having to try and do an auto reversing. But that's then another 2 turnouts and another 2 sets of switch machines, and so you know, the cost goes up from that, as opposed to just, you know, configuring one of the PM74 power sub-districts for auto reversing, and there you go, you don't have to worry about it. So everything is insulated on both sides to be able to handle that. And so I think that would work well. Other reason why I kind of went with this way is that I really only want to have 1 train in this reversing loop anywhere. Even if I had done some kind of crossover, like I wouldn't really have wanted 2 trains to be in here. You know, it's a fair length. I mean, I think this section here, it's kind of hard to get it all in camera, is 12 feet, a little over 12 feet in total. You know, so we could have had 1 train along the back wall, another train along it, just too much. Trains wouldn't have been that close together. So this gives some amount of prototypical operation where you'd have to stop, you know, come through and come out. And so it's just something a little bit different rather than having just some crossovers. That's what I'm going to have as you come into Inter Bay Yard. As you would go north out of the station in the downtown Seattle and come into Inter Bay, there will be a set of crossovers in there just because I want to have more freedom of movement, and I think that would be more representative of a yard. This is what I went with here anyway. So yeah, I think I'm going to call this video to an end. It's been kind of a lot of progress for a week and a half or so, getting all that sub roadbed down, getting then getting the track roadbed down, and then getting all the track kind of cut out, put in place, ready to roll. So yeah, I'm gonna then slowly work on doing the feeder wires for all of the track, getting those turnouts wired, ready to go, and then actually getting all that track glued down. Exact same process that I did when we were doing the stations in here. So if you're wanting some more details on how I went about that, check out some of those other videos on doing the station. Exact same process of gluing the track down, getting the feeder wires put in place, getting the turnouts wired up, and then, very cool, we'll be able to run the trains in and out. So hopefully we'll be back in a week or two with all of this wired up and with trains running, and look forward to talking to you more then. Bye.